in excess occasions a contrary excess. The Jacobins have almost always been the most useful promoters of royalty, as the flatterers of kings have been also often the blind promoters of the Republic. This comparison is perfectly simple, since the demagogues are the flatterers of the multitude. But amid those flatterers of the multitude, many of them are perfectly sincere. Without doubt, they are equally as sincere as many courtiers who, accustomed to contemplate their master through the prism of absolute power, finish by really admiring him, by almost even adoring him as a being of a superior nature, in the same manner fascinated and intoxicated by the popular favor. Many of the Democrats, sincere first, finish by suffering themselves to be carried away to commit crimes, even to murder. All those of the Saint Bartholomew, those of the old man of the mountain, were all equally the prey of a moral frenzy. The most sincere are the most dangerous. They are infinitely more so than the troop of satellites who, without conviction to find food, hover like the crows over all the battlefields. When those wretches behold the victims fall on either side, whatever they may be, they precipitate upon them. One may neglect a moment those valets of all the powers, but as for the men of heart and faith, it is to them we should attach ourselves, and if we cannot convince and enlighten them, we must combat them without intermission when their fanaticism threatens to overturn society. Penetrated with these truths, we decided on being beforehand with the Jacobins. We resolved upon changing to open hostilities our former circumspection and to make the reform succeed at any price, of which they had spoken vaguely for some time past. And we exacted at length that Sieyes should no longer retard submitting to us the development of his constitutional ameliorations. It was then that he must have thought that the moment was arrived for his wise theories to be adopted. But France, although a republic for 7 years past, was she really ripe for political liberty? The future has answered in the negative, but not one of us at that time, not one of us, foresaw the answer of the future. The accusations of royalism launched without ceasing against Sieyes were complete calumnies. That statesman had only Republican views. I think it my duty to pause here upon the project of reform, which belongs far more to him than the charter preferred by Napoleon and voted by the French people. I shall terminate this first volume in pointing out the basis of that project of reform. I will show in the second volume how, upon the miraculous arrival of the hero, the national enthusiasm was entirely submitted to his magical influence, how that torrent, too often without obstacle with the generous, warm-hearted, but changeable people, after having carried away with it existing laws, projects of changes, even sanitary precautions, precipitated itself towards the dictatorship, how that dictatorship, the necessity of which was but too evident, but which ought at least to have been temporary and placed out of the permanent law, was unfortunately incorporated in that law, how at length a conception sublime in the whole, having been mutilated, was transformed, in spite of us, into an incomplete code, incoherent and very different from what Sieyes had proposed. To each and every one, his ideas and his work. Sieyes, from the moment of the establishment of the directorial charter, was persuaded that it was not likely to live. He did not partake of our illusions. We have already said that he was so deeply penetrated with the faults of that charter that he would not accept of a place in the directory. He yielded afterwards to our entreaties in the year 7, but in the hope of a legislative reform desired by many of the deputies, all disposed to second it. These luminous communications made every day fresh adepts in our glory in having been one of the most ardent, They established before all the necessity of concentrating the executive power of replacing the 5 directors elected for 5 years and not re-elected by 3 consuls elected for 10 years and re-elected. At that epoch, there was no question of a great elector of the Republic. It was after the return from Egypt and for Napoleon that the supreme magistrature was proposed and so ill received. I find nothing in my notes relative to it before the year 8. The 3 consuls of Sieyès were to be equal in rights, and the annual residence to be exercised in turn by each of them. There was no question then either of a tribunal or, above all, of a mute legislative body. But let us proceed in order in exposing the basis of the primitive project to Brumaire. First, the division of the 3 powers. The legislative powers, executive and judicial, should be, as far as possible, independent of each other and always serve reciprocally as a barrier. Without the division of those powers, there is no political liberty. Their reunion constitutes despotism. In this sense, the conventional government was of the same sort as that of Louis XIV, and the republican government was the most despotic of the 2. Since the powers were more concentrated in the great assembly than in the great king. The parliaments, the clergy, the provincial states were poor barriers for him who said, "I am the state." But the convention had no barriers of any sort.